Okay. So I wasn't planning on making a video on this, so I'm sorry for jumping into the middle of this piece, but I just learned a new digital painting technique, and I got so excited I had to share it with you guys. While I was browsing Pinterest, I found this tutorial for digital painting that relies on overlay layers. Now, maybe this is old news, some old trick I didn't know about, and maybe I just never properly understood the overlay blending mode, but this has just completely blown my mind. So the overlay blending mode operates like a combination of multiply and screen layers, which means it can simultaneously lighten or darken the colors of the layers below it, depending on the color and the shade and the saturation of the overlay. I like using really saturated overlays to intensify the color around extreme shadows or extreme light so it doesn't get so muddy. The way the colors interact can be a little unpredictable until you get a feel for it, so I use them pretty sparingly. But then, what happens if you eliminate any color for it to interact with? The tutorial I found starts you painting completely in grayscale, so this is already off to a strong start, I think, because the great thing about drawing in one color is you get a really strong sense of contrast, and you can make sure your values are balanced through the entire composition. Colors make everything extra complicated, so it's way easier to see your full value range in one color. Plus, when you're using brushes that simulate paint mixing like I am, the shades get muddled when you put them down. I could have pure black selected on the color wheel, but when I paint on a lighter color, the program simulates mixing those colors, and it'll end up somewhere in between. It can take a lot of layers or pressure sensitivity to build up to the actual shade you're going for. The fun starts when we start using overlay layers as color layers. The regular color blending mode is very flat in comparison because it ignores all those brightness values. But on the other hand, remember, overlay makes light colors lighter and dark colors darker. Plus, it retains the saturation of the color being overlaid. That makes it really flexible for tweaking and blending colors without worrying about screwing up your values. I mean, look at what this is doing! This is just an overlay layer with some sunsetish colors slapped on top, roughly how I think the light is probably bouncing. I know that's not new. You could paint all those light and dark shadows on separate layers and individually adjust their colors for a similar effect, but this is just a really neat and quick and dirty way to color an entire painting. I'm using these overlays as clipping masks to the scenery below so I can be even quicker and dirtier about it. Although don't get me wrong, real color studies and shading by hand are really important skills. Personally, I don't recommend relying on this method or using color modes entirely anyway, but in cases like this especially, I think it's really good mood lighting. Now that I'm done gushing about this painting technique, I guess I might need to explain the context for this piece. It's a little out there even for me, and I know I really threw you into the middle of it. A closed species art and adoptable group I recently joined is hosting an advent calendar this month of adoptables. Most are listed as regular sales, but every Saturday they release one as an XTA. So an XTA basically means you have to do X to adopt the character. In this case, X is draw for or write a short story about them, and it's kind of a contest. At the end of the week, they'll go home with whoever the designer and the moderators feel put the most effort into or best captured the character in their pieces. So there's no guarantee I'll win this character just because I'm entering, which is why I don't mind getting a little experimental. It's not a serious commission. In fact, at the very least, it's just gift art. The species he's from, which are called Mhoats, by the way, I hope I said that right, are known to be able to shapeshift between bipedal and quadrupedal forms. I started drawing him as a biped until I realized he might not be able to shapeshift. See, he's an aquatic subtype of Mhoat, and they don't exactly have legs to shift into. It seems obvious in hindsight, but I clarified in the Discord server just to be safe, and sure enough, aquatic variants don't have that full range of shapeshifting ability. So I just readjusted him a little, removed the grass, and propped him up on a rock instead. All those tentacles inspired me to experiment with not just the painting technique, but to try a touch of animation. Nothing complicated, just a simple tween loop. Tweening is a technique that allows an animator to move parts of a drawing from point A to point B, and the computer interpolates the in-betweens, hence the name. So I don't actually have to draw all those extra frames myself, but it does affect how I have to set up my layers. You'll see me separating each individual tentacle that I want to move, and I'm coloring them individually. In order to tween them, I have to move each piece separate from the body, but they also have to blend into the body without looking out of place, all while they move. So the order of the layers is really important, and in fact I have to reorganize them a few times before I get it right. Where the ends of the tentacles connect to the body have to be blended out and colored kind of vaguely, so the edges aren't as obvious and it's very seamless. It's really not as difficult as I'm making it out to be, it's just extremely time-consuming. I spent just as long on drawing the character as I did painting the entire background. About 3 hours each. That said, I've never tweened in Clip Studio before. I've only done very minimal, very simple frame-by-frames, and learning was not as intuitive as I had hoped. I cut out actually animating it to spare you my clumsiness in figuring it out. A few of the tutorials I was following were either out of date, or I had a different software version, or something. In fact, maybe I'll make my own tutorial when I'm a little more confident using it. What piqued my interest about this character is that it's themed after the King in Yellow. Now, according to lore, the King in Yellow is portrayed as some horrible eldritch tentacle monster. The character originates from a collection of short stories by Robert W. Chambers. I listened to the entire 4-hour audiobook of The King in Yellow while I worked on this, and what's interesting is the king is never portrayed directly as any sort of eldritch beast in the stories. In fact, the King in Yellow isn't even a person, it's the title of a book or a play, which has been banned in most countries for inexplicably driving its readers mad. Though, sometimes the king is described as a literal physical entity. Typically an ugly, pasty, decrepit, and deformed man, usually with a face covered. There's nothing directly monstrous or even scary about the stories. They're more on the slightly uncomfortable end of the spectrum. And I still don't entirely understand the concept of the King in Yellow. I could be wrong, but from what I gather, the only connection it actually has to the H.P. Lovecraft series is that Chambers was inspired by Lovecraft's works, and the king was later referenced canonically in Lovecraft's own series. All I do know is that I love drawing tentacles, they're very fun and a niche aesthetic, and this character had lots of them. Also, this is the part I realized I drew them wrong. From zoomed out and head on, I thought that black shape was a nose, like a cow nose, but then I zoomed in really close and turned the contrast up, and I realized that was a mouth with lots of jagged teeth. That's why the edges were kind of rough. This character is part of a closed species, so I was able to double check. They do, in fact, have the shark teeth trait, but there are no traits in the species at all that might change the nose. So excuse me while I fix that. And I also realized, for as much as I gushed at the beginning about this new painting technique, I painted this character normally because I wasn't sure how the overlay layers would react with all the moving parts in the animation folders. But, you know, I had to end up merging every single piece into its own layer anyway, so I guess I could have colored it and then merged them, but now I know for next time. Luckily, I was able to put an overlay layer over the entire animation folder at the end to mellow the colors out a little bit. I also discovered that overlay trick helped me add some really cool lightning effects that I tossed in off camera. I think it all paid off in the end, though. I'm really proud of how this turned out. Best of luck to whoever does win the King in Yellow character. And if you've watched this far, thank you so much for bearing with this mess of a video. I know I rambled from painting technique to animation tweens to King in Yellow lore. This was definitely a weird one, but I enjoyed recording this video.